I am a 70-year-old man, and I never thought that the heaviest blow of my life would come not on a battlefield, not in the dark nights when I buried friends, not in the quiet mornings when I woke up alone in a bed that used to hold my late wife, but right there in the middle of a funeral. It was supposed to be a day of mourning, a day of farewell, a day where tears would flow with dignity. Instead, it turned into a day when a small hand, the hand of my grandson, slid a folded piece of paper into my palm, and with that gesture he shattered the thin veil that was covering a truth too terrifying to imagine. I can still feel the tremor of his little fingers. He leaned close to me, his lips barely moving, and whispered words that pierced deeper than the tolling bells or the sobs of the mourners. "Grandpa, don't trust them. Please don't trust them." At that moment, the world around me dissolved. The priest's voice blurred into an echo. The smell of incense became suffocating, and all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. Imagine yourself sitting in a wooden pew, surrounded by black clothes, the sobs of relatives, the shuffling of feet. You look at the coffin and you think only of loss, only of the hole that death leaves in a family. But then you feel the tug of a child's hand. You see the desperation in his eyes, and you realize that this funeral is hiding something else, something darker. Would you dare to open that note? Would you have the courage to read words that could poison every memory you thought was safe? The paper in my hand burned like a coal. My first instinct was to ignore it. Maybe it was a child's imagination, maybe just scribbles. But the way he looked at me, his eyes wide, filled with fear, far beyond his 7 years, told me that this was no game. He had seen something, he had heard something, and he trusted me. The old man everyone thought was too weak, too tired, too irrelevant to carry the burden of truth. Around me, the funeral went on. The choir sang hymns that spoke of eternal peace. The widow clutched a handkerchief to her lips, shaking. Relatives leaned toward one another, whispering words meant to soothe, but also words laced with suspicion. A man dabbed at his forehead, even though the air was cool. A woman avoided looking at the coffin, staring instead at her phone, hidden under the veil of her shawl. I noticed it all, every crack in the facade, because when you live long enough, you learn to read people like pages of a worn book. But nothing I had seen before prepared me for the dread that coiled inside my chest as I pressed that note between my fingers. I thought of my friend, the one lying in the coffin, a man I had shared bread with, fought with, celebrated with. The announcement of his sudden death had struck me like a hammer, but I had accepted it the way one accepts storms or illness. Now, though, the seed of doubt was planted, and doubt once planted grows faster than ivy on an old wall. What if his death was not an accident? What if the truth had been buried before the body? The paper remained unopened, but I could already feel that it contained something heavy. The boy clung to me, his head pressed against my sleeve, refusing to look toward the front of the church. His silence screamed louder than any cry. He was begging me not to ignore it, begging me to be the shield his father could not be, begging me to be the one person who would not turn away. And you listening to me, now put yourself in my place. Would you have torn the paper open, risking to expose a wound that could never heal? Or would you have slipped it into your pocket, convincing yourself that sometimes ignorance is the only way to keep peace in a family already broken by grief? I ask you honestly, what would you have done? Comment with the number 1 if you would have opened that note right there in the church. Before I tell you what I discovered, I need you to understand why this death, this funeral, carried such weight for me. The man lying in that coffin was not just another relative. He was my brother in all but blood, my companion through the hardest winters and the rarest springs. His name was Samuel, and to me, he was the kind of man you could call at midnight and know he would come no matter the cost. I first met him more than 50 years ago, when we were both young men with more pride than money, more dreams than sense. We worked side by side in the steel mill, our hands blistered and burned, our lungs blackened with soot. But we laughed. We drank cheap whiskey together. After long shifts, we shared stories of the futures we imagined, families, houses, better lives for our children. When I lost my firstborn daughter to illness, it was Samuel who carried me through those nights, sitting silently with me on the porch, letting me cry without shame. And when his wife left him in the early years, it was I who gave him a room in my house, a warm plate at my table, until he found his footing again. We were two pillars holding each other upright, and though time chipped away at both of us, we never fell. Our children grew up together like cousins, though no blood bound them. Christmas dinners stretched into the night, with Samuel carving the turkey while I poured the wine. Our wives shared recipes, our kids shared secrets, and for a long time, I believed that nothing could fracture that bond. We built more than memories. We built trust that became like stone. I remember one night in particular, back in the late 70s. There had been a fire in the factory. Flames roared like an angry beast, smoke choking the air. I was trapped behind a wall of sparks, certain that I would never see daylight again. But Samuel burst through with nothing but a wet cloth over his mouth, his coat wrapped around his arms. He pulled me out, half-dragged me across the floor, while beams crashed around us. My skin was scorched, my lungs torn with smoke, but I survived. I survived because of him. I told myself then that I owed him my life, and I carried that debt with gratitude, not bitterness. That is why, when the news came that Samuel had died suddenly, I grieved not only for him, but for myself, for the part of me that he carried with him. They said it was a fall down the stairs, an accident, in the late hours when he was alone at home. I believed it because I wanted to, because the alternative that someone had stolen his life was too cruel to bear. The days leading up to the funeral were heavy, but filled with memories. I sat with his children, shared stories of our youth. I watched my grandson, who had adored Samuel, place a little wooden toy car on the nightstand, where the coffin rested before burial. "He'll take it with him." My boy whispered, his voice small but sure. The gesture broke me. It was innocence. It was love. It was proof that Samuel's kindness had touched even the youngest soul in our family. I want you to understand this. I never imagined suspicion in those moments. My heart was wrapped in mourning, not in doubt. I thought of the summer evenings when Samuel and I played chess on the back porch while our wives laughed in the kitchen. I thought of the winter mornings when he showed up at my door with firewood, knowing I was too sick to chop it myself. I thought of his booming laugh, the way he sang out of tune during birthday parties, the way he always called my son Champ, even when he was a grown man with gray in his hair. All of this is why the paper in my pocket burned so fiercely. Because how could I reconcile those memories, those decades of loyalty, with the suggestion that Samuel's death was not an accident? How could I imagine that, in the shadows of this family, someone had dared to plot against the very man who had saved me? As I sat in that pew listening to the priest speak of eternal rest, I remembered the promises Samuel and I had once made. We had said that no matter what, we would protect each other's families. If one of us fell, the other would stand as guardian for the children, the grandchildren, for the legacy of everything we had worked for. That promise, spoken in the foolish courage of youth, suddenly rang in my ears like a command. If Samuel was gone, then it was my duty to be his voice, his shield, his avenger. I also remembered the last time I saw him alive. It was only a week before his death. He came by my house looking tired, his shoulders heavy. We sat at the table and drank coffee. He didn't say much at first, just stared into the steam rising from his cup. But then he looked at me and said words that now echo with new meaning. "If anything happens to me, promise me you'll watch over them." I laughed it off, then told him he was just getting old, just feeling the weight of years. He smiled, but it was a sad smile, one that now chills me when I think of it. So, when that note touched my palm in the church when my grandson's eyes pleaded with me to read it, I wasn't just holding a piece of paper. I was holding Samuel's last unspoken cry, the continuation of the promise we had made in our youth. I could no longer pretend. I could no longer hide behind mourning. The time for silence had ended. And I need to ask you listening to me, now, have you ever had someone in your life that you trusted with everything, someone you believed would stand by you until the very end? If you have, then you know the pain of losing them is more than grief. It is like losing a part of your own soul. If you have someone like that, write yes in the comments. Let me see how many of you understand what it means to have a brother not by blood, but by choice. Grief is supposed to bring families closer, but sometimes it does the opposite. Sometimes it shines a light on cracks that were already there, cracks most people prefer not to notice. After Samuel's death, I began to notice things that didn't sit right with me, though at first I convinced myself they were only shadows of my imagination. In the days before the funeral, I visited Samuel's house. I wanted to stand in the place where he had lived his final moments, to breathe in the air he had breathed, to let my heart say goodbye. His eldest son greeted me at the door, his face pale, his voice flat. Behind him, the living room was strangely bare. The photographs that used to hang above the mantel were gone, the ones of his wedding, his firstborn's baptism, even the picture of him and me from our days in the mill. When I asked about them, the son shifted uncomfortably. "We're sorting through things," he said. but the way he avoided my eyes told me something else. I moved toward the desk Samuel used to keep in the corner. It was empty. The drawers once cluttered with notebooks. Bills and small trinkets were all cleared out. Not a single scrap of paper remained. I felt a chill creep over me. Samuel had always been a man who kept records, who scribbled notes about everything. For his desk to be bare was like seeing his voice erased from the world. That night, I sat in my chair and told myself it didn't matter. People grieve in strange ways. Maybe his children were trying to protect his memory, to put away the reminders that hurt too much to look at. I forced myself to believe it. After all, who was I to question their choices? I was just the old friend, the aging man, who had already outlived too many people. But the doubts kept multiplying. At the wake, I overheard whispers that prickled my skin. Two relatives stood in the kitchen, their voices hushed but sharp enough for me to catch pieces of the conversation. The insurance, worth more than the house, one muttered. He didn't tell her. He kept it hidden until the end, the other replied. Their eyes darted toward the living room, where Samuel's widow sat, her hands shaking over a teacup. They stopped talking the moment they noticed me, their smiles thin forced. Then there was the matter of Samuel's watch. It was a heavy silver piece he had worn every day for decades, a gift from his father, an heirloom he had promised to pass down to his grandson. I had seen it on his wrist only a week before his death, but when I asked about it after he passed, his daughter-in-law said lightly, "Oh, he must have misplaced it. You know how forgetful he was." She laughed in a way that made my stomach twist. Samuel was many things: stubborn, loud, sentimental, but never careless, with something that held his father's name engraved on the back. I told myself to let it go. Old men like me were prone to suspicion. We see ghosts in the corners, conspiracies in the silence. I tried to remind myself that grief bends the mind, that maybe I was clinging too tightly to details. Yet my grandson's note burning in my pocket whispered otherwise. His little eyes had seen something. Children do not lie about fear. They may misunderstand, they may exaggerate, but fear, true fear, cannot be faked. The funeral preparations brought even more unease. I noticed how one cousin took charge of the arrangements with unusual eagerness, deciding where the coffin would rest, choosing the songs, even dictating who would speak. His voice carried too much authority, as though the funeral were a stage, and he the director. When I offered a suggestion that we sing Samuel's favorite hymn, he dismissed me with a smile too polite, too sharp. "Perhaps another time," he said. "Another time for a funeral. There is no other time." I began to watch people more closely. I noticed glances exchanged across the room, quick nods, murmurs that stopped when I walked by. I saw the widow's trembling hands when she was handed a document to sign, a document she didn't even read, trusting the words of those who placed it in front of her. I saw the way one nephew patted her shoulder with exaggerated sympathy, his eyes already scanning the room for someone else to charm. Every sign screamed at me, but I silenced my own instincts. Maybe because I was afraid of the truth. Maybe because I didn't want to believe that a family could turn on itself in the shadow of death. Maybe because admitting the possibility meant I would have to act, and acting would break everything open. On the morning of the funeral, I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the tie that my late wife had once bought me. My face looked back at me, lined with years, with weariness. "Don't start trouble," I told myself. "Be there to honor Samuel, not to chase shadows." Yet deep down, I already knew trouble had found me, whether I sought it or not. When I walked into the church, the first thing I noticed was the coffin. It gleamed under the dim light, polished perfect. But what chilled me was the sight of Samuel's left hand resting stiffly on the satin. The ring, his wedding band, the one he had never removed in 40 years, was gone. In its place was another ring, newer, shinier, wrong. My breath caught in my throat. Only a week ago at my table, I had seen the worn gold band with a scratch near the edge. This ring had no scratch. This was not his ring. I felt my knees weaken. I gripped the pew to keep from falling. My grandson tugged at my sleeve, then his eyes wide with that same fear, as if he had been waiting for me to notice. That was when he slid me the paper, as if to say, "Now you see it too. Now you know I'm not lying." I looked at the note again, unopened, and I understood why he had written it. Because in a room filled with adults, the only person he trusted to act was me, the old man everyone overlooked, the one they thought had nothing left to give. And I need to ask you now, have you ever seen small cracks in people you thought you could trust? Little signs that whisper something is wrong, even when everyone else insists everything is fine. If you have, write the number 8 in the comments. Let me see how many of you know what it means to notice the truth before anyone else dares to say it. I sat in that pew with my grandson's little note burning in my palm. The church was filled with the low murmur of mourners, the smell of lilies so strong it clung to my throat. The coffin stood at the front, Samuel's face frozen in its final stillness, but I could not keep my eyes on him. My gaze dropped again and again to that folded square of paper. I thought about leaving it closed. Maybe the boy had misunderstood. Maybe he had written something born of his grief, his fear. Children sometimes see monsters in shadows. But I remembered his trembling hand, the way he had pressed it into mine with such urgency. He hadn't just given me a note. He had given me his trust. So I unfolded it, slowly, carefully, as if opening it too quickly would release some poison. My eyes scanned the words, shaky, uneven, but unmistakably written by a child who had heard something he should never have heard. "Grandpa, they said Uncle made it look like an accident." The words carved into me like a blade. My breath caught in my chest. The whole world seemed to tilt. My heart pounded so loud I feared others could hear it. I read it again, hoping I had misunderstood, but the words stayed the same. They said Uncle made it look like an accident. I clenched the paper, my fingers trembling. My first thought was denial. No, my old mind was twisting it. My grandson must have overheard wrong, misinterpreted some careless conversation. But then I remembered the missing watch, the missing ring, the clear desk, the strange eagerness in arranging the funeral, the whispers about insurance. One by one, those cracks I had tried to ignore now formed into a solid wall of truth. Samuel hadn't just died. He had been killed. I looked at my grandson Leo, his clear eyes locked on me. He was waiting to see what I would do, whether the man he trusted most in this world would stand up or stay silent. And in that moment, I felt the weight of my age, the years that had made me slow, tired, invisible. But I also felt something else, a spark that had not died, a fire that still burned. I slipped the note into my pocket, pressing it against my chest. My hands were damp, my pulse racing. I forced myself to breathe. No one else could know yet. Not here, not now. I had to be smart. I had to play the role they all expected of me, the grieving, harmless old man. The priest began to speak, his voice echoing through the vaulted ceiling, words about eternal rest, about peace. But my mind was miles away. I studied the faces of those around me, searching for guilt, for fear. My eyes landed on Samuel's younger brother, Michael. He sat stiffly in the second row, his jaw clenched, his hands folded too tightly. When the priest mentioned Samuel's sudden passing, I saw his eyes flicker just for a moment, like a candle fighting the wind. I remembered the late nights years ago when Samuel had confided in me. "Michael has always been reckless with money," he had said, his brow furrowed. "If I'm not careful, he'll drag the family into ruin." At the time, I thought it was just brotherly rivalry, the way siblings sometimes carry grudges from childhood. But now those words returned to me like a prophecy I had ignored. The service ended, and the mourners rose, their footsteps echoing against the stone floor. I moved slowly, deliberately, giving myself time to think. My grandson stayed close, his small hand gripping mine, as if afraid I would let go. I leaned down and whispered, "Not a word to anyone yet. Do you understand?" He nodded, his little face grave beyond his years. At the graveside, as the coffin was lowered into the earth, I felt a storm raging inside me. The shovel scraped against the dirt, each sound like a drumbeat of accusation. Samuel was gone, sealed beneath the soil, but the truth of his death was still above ground, dangerous, festering. After the burial, people gathered in the family home for food and drinks, a strange ritual of comfort. Laughter mixed with tears, voices too loud for a day of mourning. I stayed on the edges observing. That's what old men are good at, watching, listening, blending into the background. No one notices the man in the corner with a cup of black coffee, but he notices everything. And I noticed Michael. His smile was forced, his laugh too sharp. He clinked glasses with cousins, embraced aunts, but there was a hollowness in his eyes. Every so often he would step away, pulling out his phone, whispering into it with his back turned. When he caught me watching once, his jaw tightened and he looked away quickly. That was when I knew. The note wasn't just a child's fear, it was the truth. I excused myself, slipping quietly down the hall to Samuel's old study. The door was half open, the room stripped bare, but I noticed something others might not. A faint mark on the carpet where the desk had once stood. Beside it, a small scrap of paper, torn and forgotten. I bent down, my knees creaking, and picked it up. The words were incomplete, but clear enough. policy beneficiary change. My blood ran cold. Insurance. Money. The whispers I had overheard were no longer rumors. They were the motive. I tucked the scrap into my pocket with the note. Together, they painted a picture darker than I wanted to admit. My best friend, my brother in spirit, had been murdered, and the man responsible was standing in the next room, laughing with a glass of whiskey in his hand. I returned to the living room, forcing my face into the mask of sorrow. No one looked twice. No one ever does. That is the advantage of being old. They think you are harmless, blind, half gone already. But they forget that age teaches patience, and patience uncovers the truth. That night, when the house was finally quiet, I sat alone in my bedroom. The note lay open on the table beside the scrap of paper. My hands shook not from weakness, but from rage. Rage at the betrayal, at the greed, at the audacity to turn a funeral into a stage for lies. Rage at myself for not seeing it sooner, for letting Samuel die without protection. I swore then that I would not let this rest. I may be old, but I am not finished. I still have teeth, and I will use them. For Samuel, for my grandson who trusted me with the truth. For myself, because dignity is the only thing a man carries to his grave. And now I ask you, if you were in my place holding that note in your hands, would you stay silent to keep the peace, or would you rise to expose the truth? Write yes in the comments if you would speak out. Write no if you would stay quiet. I want to see how many of you would dare to risk everything for justice. Because I already know my answer. I didn't sleep that night. The paper with my grandson's shaky handwriting lay on the table, its words burning into me like firebrands. They said Uncle made it look like an accident. I stared at it until the candle melted low, the shadows crawling along the walls like accusing fingers. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw Samuel's face not at peace in the coffin, but crying out to me, "Don't let them bury the truth with me." By morning, my hands trembled, not from age, but from fury barely contained. I knew silence would be easier. I could fold the note, hide it in a drawer, convince myself it was only the imagination of a child. But the missing watch, the false ring, the bare desk, the insurance whispers, they screamed at me louder than my conscience could ignore. And yet, I had to be careful. One misstep and the truth would be twisted against me. An old man's suspicions, they'd say. Grief has clouded his mind. They'd dismiss me, mock me, maybe even silence me. But I've lived long enough to know one thing: the moment you decide to pursue the truth, you put yourself in danger. 2 days after the funeral, the family gathered at Samuel's house for the reading of the will. I arrived early, my grandson clutching my hand. His presence gave me strength. As we entered, I scanned the faces. Some were pale with grief, some already glowing with anticipation. And then there was Michael Samuel's brother. He was freshly shaven, his suit crisp, his handshake firm. Too firm. Like a man trying too hard to play the role of the respectable mourner. His eyes met mine for a fraction of a second before sliding away. The lawyer, an older man with rimmed glasses, cleared his throat and began. His voice was steady, professional, reading Samuel's words from the page. To his wife, he left the house. To his children, his modest savings. But then came the part that froze the air in the room. The life insurance policy, the sum, far larger than any of us expected, was listed with a new beneficiary. Not his wife, not his children, his brother Michael. Gasps rippled across the room. The widow clutched her chest. Michael feigned surprise, even raising his hands as if to say, "I had no idea." But I watched him closely. The corners of his mouth twitched ever so slightly, like a wolf trying to hide its grin. The lawyer explained the document had been signed only a month before Samuel's death. A month. My blood boiled. The scrap of paper I had found in Samuel's study suddenly roared with truth. Beneficiary change. It had not been a clerical error. It had been the beginning of the plan. The room erupted in whispers. Some defended Michael. He must have been helping Samuel with his affairs. Others cast suspicious glances. But I sat in silence, my jaw tight, my fists clenched on the arms of my chair. My grandson pressed closer to me, sensing the storm beneath my skin. Later in the kitchen, I overheard two cousins whispering. "You think he really changed it willingly?" one asked. "Or did Michael?" The other shushed him, noticing me standing in the doorway. They smiled nervously, quickly excusing themselves. But their unfinished words told me enough. I wasn't the only one who smelled rot. That evening, as guests left, I lingered. The widow, eyes red and swollen, placed her hand on mine. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Why would Samuel do this? He never trusted Michael. Her voice broke her body trembling. I wanted to tell her the truth to lay the note before her, but I couldn't yet. Not without proof stronger than the word of a child and the suspicion of an old man. So I promised her gently, "There are things you mustn't sign, not yet. Do you hear me? Don't put your name on anything until you're certain." She nodded weakly, clinging to my warning, as if it were the only rope keeping her from drowning. Over the next week, more signs appeared, each one another nail in Michael's coffin, or in mine if I wasn't careful. One afternoon, I stopped by the local bar where men still remembered me from my younger days. There, I heard whispers of Michael's debts, gambling, failed investments, shady loans. He was desperate, one man muttered into his glass. And then his brother dies, and suddenly he's set to inherit a fortune. Doesn't smell right. At night, I went through old letters Samuel had once given me, tucked away in a box in my attic. I found one written just weeks before his death. In it, Samuel mentioned feeling watched followed. He dismissed it as paranoia, but reading it now, I knew better. He had sensed the noose tightening around him, but he had not realized the hand holding it was his own brother's. The final straw came when I caught Michael in a lie. I asked him casually about Samuel's watch, the one that had vanished. He smiled, said Samuel had pawned it years ago during a rough patch. But I remembered clearly only last month Samuel had shown me the watch, polishing it with a rag, telling me he planned to pass it to his grandson when the boy turned 18. That watch had been with him until the end. Michael's lie confirmed what I already knew. He had taken it. And if he had taken that, what else had he stolen? My rage grew until it felt like a second heartbeat. But rage without direction is useless. I needed a plan. So I began to write everything down, the note from my grandson, the scrap from the study, the words of the will, the whispers of debt, the missing watch, the false ring. Piece by piece, I was building a wall of truth, one they could not knock down by calling me senile. And yet, with each piece, the danger grew. One night, I found my front gate unlatched, though I had closed it myself. Another time, I heard footsteps behind me on a quiet street, only for them to vanish when I turned. Once my grandson swore he saw a man standing by the tree outside our window watching. Fear crept in, cold and sharp. But fear is an old friend of mine. I've lived through wars, betrayals, nights darker than this. Fear sharpens the mind if you don't let it rule you. I knew the storm was coming. Michael was too careful to leave me alone if he suspected I was digging. And I was digging. Now I turn to you, the ones listening to my voice. Tell me honestly, if someone in your own bloodline betrayed family for greed, would you expose them, or would you stay silent to protect the family's name? Write the number 9 in the comments if you'd expose them. Write 0 if you'd keep the silence. Let me see how many of you are willing to risk it all for truth. Because for me, there is no turning back. The cracks have become fractures, and soon the whole facade will collapse. And when it does, I must be ready to stand in the open, no longer the quiet old man in the corner, but the last shield Samuel has left. There comes a moment when silence becomes betrayal. For weeks I had carried the truth like a stone in my chest, each day heavier than the last. My notes grew thicker, my suspicions sharper, but the family remained blind, lulled by Michael's smiles and his feigned grief. I knew the storm had to break, and I knew it had to break with me. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. Samuel's widow called a family dinner. She said, to discuss the future. When I arrived, the air in the dining room was already thick with tension. The table was set with roast chicken and potatoes, but no one touched the food. The widow sat at the head, her eyes hollow. The children whispered among themselves. And at the far end sat Michael, polished as ever, his silver cufflinks gleaming, his smile too wide. I took my place beside my grandson, who leaned against me, silent but watchful. He knew, though, I hadn't told him that tonight would be the night. The meal began with small talk, shallow words that fell flat. Halfway through, Michael cleared his throat and spoke, his voice smooth as oil. "We need to make decisions. Samuel wanted me to manage the policy. It's only right. I can ensure the money is used wisely." The widow flinched. One of the sons shifted uncomfortably. A daughter whispered, "But why you, why not us, his own children?" Michael spread his hands, all false humility. "Because Samuel trusted me. He signed the papers. I didn't ask for it." That was the moment. My blood thundered in my ears. I could stay silent and let the lie bury Samuel twice, once in the ground and once in memory. Or I could stand knowing it would tear everything open. I rose slowly, leaning on the table, my chair scraping against the floor, with a sound that silenced the room. All eyes turned to me. The old man they thought too weak, too spent to matter. "You're lying," I said, my voice steady, louder than I expected. Michael blinked, feigning shock. "Excuse me?" "You're lying," I repeated, pulling the folded note from my pocket, the one my grandson had given me at the funeral. "And I have proof." A gasp rippled through the room. The widow's eyes widened. My grandson gripped my sleeve as if to steady me. Michael chuckled low and dismissive. "Proof? From you?" An old man half out of his mind. I laid the note on the table. "This was written by my grandson. He overheard you, Michael. He heard you say you made it look like an accident." The room erupted shouts, denials, whispers. Michael's face hardened, the mask slipping. "That's absurd. You'd trust a child's scribble over my word." But before he could continue, I pulled out the torn scrap from Samuel's study. "And this," I said, my hand, trembling not with fear but with fury, a note about the beneficiary change. "Found where Samuel kept his desk. Why was it hidden, Michael? Why clear the room before the funeral?" Michael's eyes darted to the paper, then back to me. For the first time, doubt flickered in his face. I pressed on, my voice rising. "And what about the watch, the ring things? Samuel never would have given up willingly. They disappeared the moment he died. Do you deny that too?" The widow gasped. One of the sons slammed his fist on the table. "Where is father's watch?" Michael stood, his chair toppling. His smile was gone, now replaced by something raw, ugly. "You old fool," he spat. "You think you can accuse me with scraps of paper and the ramblings of a child." Silence fell heavy and suffocating. My grandson, small but steady, spoke, then his voice clear as a bell. "I heard you, Uncle. You said it in the kitchen. You said, 'No one will know. It looks like an accident.'" All eyes turned to him. A child's voice untainted by greed or schemes. The kind of voice no lie could easily drown. Michael's face twisted. "He's lying." You filled his head with stories. I stepped forward, my rage boiling over. "No, Michael. You filled this family with lies. Samuel trusted you, and you killed him for money." The words hung in the air like thunder. The widow began to weep, her shoulders shaking. The children shouted, some at Michael, some at each other, the room descending into chaos. Michael slammed his fist on the table. "Enough, you want proof." Fine, Samuel was weak, careless. I did what had to be done. He was wasting everything, and I. He stopped too late, realizing what had slipped from his tongue. The room froze. His confession, half-spoken, echoed louder than any scream. The widow's sobs turned into a wail. One of the sons lunged across the table, fists clenched, but others pulled him back. My grandson clung to me, trembling. I straightened my back, the weight of years falling from my shoulders. "You've admitted it," I said, my voice cold as stone. "In front of your family, in front of God. There's no going back now." Michael's face went pale, then flushed with fury. "You'll regret this," he hissed at me, his eyes burning with hatred. But I didn't flinch. I had looked death in the eye before, and I was not afraid. "No, Michael," I said. "The only one who will regret is you." The room erupted again, shouts, cries, threats. But above it all, I felt a strange calm. The truth was out. The facade was shattered. The family could no longer hide behind silence. And now, I turn to you, the ones listening. If you had been there hearing the confession with your own ears, would you have leapt across the table to strike him? Or would you have stood still, letting his own words damn him? Comment, fight, if you'd strike. Or still, if you'd let the truth speak for itself. Because that night, I didn't need to fight. His words had already drawn the blood that mattered most. His mask was gone, and his soul laid bare. The house that night became a battlefield of silence and shouts. After Michael's outburst, no one dared pretend anymore. The truth had clawed its way out, bloody and undeniable. The widow collapsed into her chair, her tears falling onto the untouched plates of food. Samuel's children looked at each other, with eyes filled with grief and rage, their unity fractured, but their anger pointed in the same direction. Michael, for all his bluster, shrank beneath the weight of their stares. He tried to backtrack, to twist his words, but it was too late. What slips out in anger is often closer to truth than all the careful speeches. He had confessed in his fury, and every soul in that room knew it. The widow finally raised her head, her voice trembling but sharp as glass. "Get out," she whispered, then louder with a force I had never heard from her before. "Get out of this house, Michael. You will never sit at this table again." Michael sneered, but I saw the flicker of fear in his eyes. For the first time, he realized he was alone. No allies, no excuses, no mask left to wear. He grabbed his coat, muttering curses under his breath, and stormed out, slamming the door so hard the walls shook. The silence afterward was heavier than any scream. My grandson pressed against me, his little hand gripping mine like an anchor. The widow covered her face with her hands and sobbed, the sound breaking what was left of our hearts. That night changed everything. The next morning, the lawyer was called again. The widow demanded a full review of the documents, the insurance policy, every signature and date. Investigators were brought in, questions, asked, records checked. And though Michael tried to resist, his lies crumbled faster than he could rebuild them. His debts, his desperate attempts to secure money, the suspicious timing of Samuel's accident, all of it surfaced like bones rising from shallow soil. I watched it unfold, not with triumph, but with sorrow. For no matter what justice came, Samuel remained in the ground, his laughter gone, his friendship now a memory carved into my old heart. Betrayal doesn't end when it's exposed. It lingers, a wound that never fully closes. And yet, in the middle of the wreckage, there was light. My grandson, the boy who had first dared to whisper the truth, carried himself with a quiet pride. He had been the spark, the voice no one could dismiss. Each time I looked at him, I felt the weight of what I owed him. Because he had trusted me with that note, I had found the courage to rise. One evening, weeks later, we sat on the porch together, the summer air warm, the cicadas singing. He looked up at me with those clear eyes and asked, "Grandpa, is Uncle going to jail?" I took a long breath before answering. Maybe, maybe not. The law moves slow, and sometimes men like him slip through cracks. But what matters is this: he will never again be trusted. He will never again hide behind family. His mask is gone. The boy nodded solemnly, as though he understood more than a child should. Then he leaned his head against my arm and whispered, "Thank you for believing me." Those words nearly broke me, because all my life I had prided myself on being strong, on fighting battles with my fists, my voice, my will. But in the end, the greatest battle had been fought not with strength, but with belief. Believing the trembling words of a child, believing the whisper of truth when the world preferred lies. In time, the family began to heal, slowly, painfully. The widow no longer wept every morning, though her eyes would never shine the same way again. The children began to rebuild their trust piece by fragile piece. And I, the old man they once overlooked, found myself becoming the anchor, the voice that reminded them of dignity when bitterness threatened to consume them. As for Michael, he faded from our lives like a bad dream. The last I heard, he was drowning in his debts, his name a curse in every room he entered. That is the price of betrayal, not only losing what you wanted, but losing yourself. And I learned something I want you listening now to take with you. Age does not mean weakness. Silence does not mean ignorance. Even when the world thinks you are finished, you still carry the power to change the course of a family, to unmask a lie, to protect the ones who cannot protect themselves. Dignity, my friends, is not given. It is claimed, and on that night in that house, filled with broken voices and shattered trust, I claimed mine. Now I turn to you. If you have ever been betrayed by someone you trusted, if you have ever had to rise when silence would have been easier, I want you to write the number 1 in the comments. Let us see how many of us carry those scars, and how many of us refuse to let them define us. And if you think you would have done the same, stood, spoken, exposed, the truth, write okay in the comments. Because sometimes the only way to honor the dead is to keep the living honest. This story is not about revenge. It is about dignity. About the courage to stand when every voice tells you to sit, about the choice to speak when silence feels safer. And I promise you this, as long as breath remains in me, I will never stop speaking, for Samuel, for my grandson, for myself.